The plane trembled slightly from turbulence, barely enough to stir the glasses of champagne in first class. Most passengers barely noticed. Keanu Reeves did. He had flown enough to know when something felt off. His fingers unconsciously tightened around the armrest as his gaze swept the cabin. The usual faces: businessmen absorbed in their laptops, a woman flipping through a magazine, an elderly couple quietly chatting. And then him, across the aisle, near the window, sat a man who radiated quiet authority. Silver hair, perfectly pressed navy suit, a gold Rolex glinting under the dim cabin lights. He lifted his glass of whiskey with slow precision, his expression unreadable. Keanu wasn't the type to judge people by their appearance, but the assistant sitting next to the man caught his attention. The young man, sharp-dressed and rigid in posture, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek black device. He tapped the screen, his fingers moving with quiet urgency. Beep! Keanu's gaze flickered to the digital flight display. 1 hour, 27 minutes to landing. His instincts stirred. Why did he just mark the time? Then came another sign. A flight attendant, a woman in her early 30s with neatly tied auburn hair, paused beside Keanu's seat. Her face was professional, but her eyes told another story. She carefully set a glass of water on his tray, then, without looking directly at him, whispered just loud enough for only him to hear. "Be careful, Mr. Reeves." She was gone before he could ask a single question. Keanu exhaled slowly. 1 hour, 25 minutes. Something was happening on this flight. And whatever it was, he was already in the middle of it. Keanu Reeves had spent decades studying people, on screen and off. He could recognize arrogance a mile away. And Victor Hargrove oozed it. Sitting across the aisle in his immaculately tailored suit, whiskey swirling lazily in his glass. Victor looked less like a businessman and more like a king surveying his kingdom. Keanu leaned back in his seat, casually observing. Most people, when drinking, lifted their glass instinctively. Victor waited. Not a single sip until his assistant had tapped something on his mysterious black device. Then, and only then, did Victor take a slow, deliberate drink, as if he were marking a moment. Keanu's fingers tapped lightly on his armrest. "What are you waiting for, Hargrove?" Then, as if reading his thoughts, Victor smirked. A slow, knowing expression, like a man who was already 5 steps ahead in a game Keanu didn't even know he was playing. Victor set his glass down gently and turned his gaze toward Keanu, studying him with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "Tell me, Mr. Reeves," he began smoothly, "do you always make it a habit to pay such close attention to strangers?" Keanu didn't blink. "Only when they're interesting." Victor chuckled, a deep, confident sound, like a man accustomed to winning every conversation before it even started. "I suppose I should be flattered," he mused. "Or perhaps suspicious." Keanu tilted his head. "That depends. Should I be?" Another smirk. Victor swirled his whiskey. "Oh, you're good. I like that." Keanu simply watched. The best way to make a man talk. Say nothing. Victor sighed dramatically, leaning back. "You see, I've always found actors fascinating. Masters of deception. Illusionists." Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. "And what does that make businessmen?" Victor exhaled through his nose. "The ones who write the script." A quiet challenge. Keanu let the words hang between them. A lesser man would have rushed to fill the silence. Victor expected that. Instead, Keanu took a slow sip of water, holding Victor's gaze. Finally, Victor chuckled again. "You don't flinch easily. I respect that." But Keanu had already caught the first crack in his armor. Because men like Victor, they didn't hand out compliments unless they were trying to distract you. Then, something unexpected happened. Victor's phone vibrated. He didn't react right away. Just let the screen light up, waiting. Then, with carefully measured casualness, he lifted the phone and glanced at the message. For half a second, his expression changed. A flicker of tension. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass before he smoothly flipped the phone face down on the tray table. Keanu noticed. A man like Victor? He never showed his hand, but that message had bothered him. Keanu casually stretched, shifting in his seat just enough to catch a glimpse of the phone's lock screen before it went dark. One word. Envelope with arrow, unconfirmed. What needed confirmation, Victor? And why did it make you nervous? Keanu shifted his attention. Victor's assistant, the one with the mysterious black device, had been watching his boss carefully. And when the message arrived, his eyes had flicked upward before Victor even moved. He was waiting for that message, and judging by the way his jaw tightened, he didn't like what it said. Keanu exhaled slowly. Something is wrong with their plan. Victor picked up his whiskey again. Tell me something, Keanu. Do you believe in luck? Keanu raised an eyebrow. Luck? Victor nodded toward the passengers in first class. Most of these people believe they got here through hard work. Sacrifice. They lied to themselves. The truth. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to make the words feel dangerous. The world runs on numbers, and the people who control those numbers, they don't believe in luck. Keanu met his gaze, unfazed. Sounds like a lonely way to live. Victor chuckled. Lonely? No. Powerful? Absolutely. A beat. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, Victor added, but you already know that, don't you? Keanu took his time responding, because this was the moment Victor was testing him. He wanted to know if Keanu was just an actor or something more. Keanu smiled. I know that power makes people reckless. Victor exhaled, amused. And I know that men who ask too many questions don't always get to hear the answers. The threat was clear. And for the first time, Keanu realized Victor didn't see him as a celebrity anymore. He saw him as a problem. Then, beep. The assistant's black device pulsed again. Victor didn't look at it. He didn't have to. His smirk returned just slightly. Then he took another sip of whiskey, right on cue. Keanu's pulse quickened. They weren't marking time. They were marking events. Keanu glanced at the digital flight display. Hourglass not done, 1 hour 10 minutes to landing. He suddenly had a terrifying thought. What if Victor didn't just know what was happening? What if he was the one controlling it? A shadow moved beside him. Sarah, the flight attendant, passed again, discreetly adjusting a napkin on his tray. Under her breath, she murmured, "They're not the only ones on board." Keanu froze. His mind raced. How many more were there? And what exactly were they waiting for? Hourglass not done, 1 hour 5 minutes to landing. The countdown wasn't for an arrival. It was for something else entirely. Keanu Reeves had met dangerous men before. Some walked into rooms and owned them with sheer presence. Others commanded power through money, fear, or reputation. And then there were the ones you barely noticed. The ones who spoke in whispers, who moved through the world without leaving footprints. Those were the ones who truly scared him. And that's exactly what Victor Hargrove's assistant was. A man you wouldn't remember if you passed him on the street. Hey, ghost in a suit. Keanu shifted slightly, adjusting his position just enough to get a better look at him. His hair was short, neatly styled. His posture rigid. His hands? Calm, precise, controlled. And in those hands, the small black device that kept beeping in steady, rhythmic intervals. Not a message, not a call. Hey, signal. And whatever it was doing, Victor wasn't even checking it anymore. He already knew what it meant. Keanu's pulse quickened. What the hell are they waiting for? The next time the device beeped, Keanu paid attention. Not just to the sound, to the timing. Hourglass not done. 1 hour 3 minutes to landing. Beep. Victor lifted his whiskey, took a slow sip. Then, nothing. Keanu let out a slow breath. They weren't using the device to receive information. They were using it to coordinate. And that meant someone else on this plane was getting the same signal. Someone else was waiting for the next step, and Keanu had no idea how many of them there were. Keanu needed answers. Subtlety wasn't an option anymore. Leaning forward slightly, he glanced at Victor's assistant and said, "What's your name?" The man didn't even blink, didn't react. It took Victor 3 seconds to answer for him. "Mr. Reeves, this is Mr. Nash." Keanu tilted his head, studying him. "First or last name?" Victor smirked. "Does it matter?" Nash didn't move, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the name at all. Keanu's stomach turned. It's fake. A name without a history. A name meant to disappear. He forced a smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Nash." The man finally looked at him, His expression didn't change, but his fingers moved slightly against the device. Beep. Keanu didn't like the way that felt. Like Nash was replying to him without words. Like he'd just sent a message to someone else on the plane. For the next 5 minutes, Keanu said nothing. He just watched, and he noticed something strange. Victor was relaxed. Too relaxed. The turbulence from earlier had passed. The cabin was calm. But Victor? He looked like a man who had already won. And Nash was waiting. That was the difference. Victor knew how the night would end. Nash was waiting for confirmation. That meant the plan wasn't finished yet. Keanu exhaled slowly. And I don't think I'm going to like the next part. Keanu had been memorizing the patterns of the device's beeps. They came in sets, every 15 minutes, like check-ins. But this time, the next beep came, 4 minutes early. Nash's expression changed, just slightly, and Victor's smirk disappeared for the first time. Keanu's stomach clenched. That wasn't part of the plan, which meant something unexpected had happened. Victor calmly picked up his phone and checked the screen. Another message. This time, Keanu was watching closely. And for just a moment, just half a second, Victor frowned. He slipped the phone back onto the tray, but his fingers lingered on it. His mind was somewhere else. Keanu leaned slightly forward. Problem. Victor turned his head slowly, then gave him a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You ask a lot of questions. Keanu's own smirk returned. I like puzzles. Victor exhaled, shaking his head. Then maybe you should consider a different flight. Hey, threat. Victor wasn't amused anymore. And that meant one thing. Something wasn't going according to plan. Keanu sat back, letting the moment pass. But he needed more information. And he knew exactly where to get it. Sarah, the flight attendant who warned him. He stood, stretching casually before heading toward the galley. Sarah was there, organizing drink trays, but when she saw him, she went pale. Mr. Reeves, you shouldn't. Keanu held up a hand. I need to know. Who else on this plane is watching? Sarah swallowed hard. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I think it's the pilots. Keanu's blood ran cold. Keanu had been in enough Hollywood thrillers to know one thing. The cockpit was supposed to be the safest place on the plane. But if Sarah was right, then this wasn't just a hostile takeover. It was a controlled event. And suddenly, the beeping device made sense. It wasn't tracking anything. It was communicating directly with the flight deck. The pilots weren't flying anymore. They were receiving instructions. Keanu looked at the flight display. Hourglass not done. 47 minutes to landing. Or rather, 47 minutes until whatever Victor was planning. Sarah touched his arm, her voice shaky. Whatever you're thinking, you need to be careful. Victor, he's not just a businessman. Keanu's jaw tightened. Then what is he? She hesitated. Then, in the faintest whisper, she said, he's the man they send when things need to disappear. Keanu felt a chill, because in that moment he realized this wasn't about money. It wasn't about ransom. This flight wasn't supposed to land. Keanu walked back toward his seat, his mind racing. Victor was watching him now, that smirk returning. Enjoy your little walk? Keanu didn't answer, because he already knew he had to act. The only question was how. And then, before he could decide, beep. But this time, it wasn't the assistant's device. It was Keanu's phone. A message from his intelligence contact. Envelope with arrow, confirmed. Signal locked. They're not landing in New York. Keanu felt his heartbeat slam in his chest. Victor's smirk deepened. And then, the cabin lights flickered. The plane tilted slightly. And for the first time, Keanu saw Victor Hargrove exhale. Like a man who had been waiting for the real game to begin. Keanu Reeves had always trusted his instincts. And right now, they were screaming. The plane's cabin lights flickered. Again, just for a second. Barely enough for most passengers to notice. But Keanu noticed. Because Victor Hargrove noticed too. Sitting across the aisle, the silver-haired businessman remained calm. But there was something in his body language A quiet exhale, a glance toward his assistant, a tiny nod. The kind of nod that meant something had begun. Keanu gritted his teeth. It wasn't turbulence. It was a signal. Keanu stood, moving toward the galley at the front of the cabin. The moment Sarah saw him coming, she froze. The color drained from her face, and for a second, she just stared. Then she quickly turned, pretending to adjust a tray of champagne glasses. Sarah, Keanu kept his voice low. We need to talk. She swallowed hard, shaking her head slightly. You shouldn't be up here. Keanu glanced toward the cockpit door. It was sealed shut. No window, no way to see inside. Who was flying this plane? He turned back to her. You said Victor wasn't supposed to be on this flight. What did you mean? Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set a glass down. I can't. Keanu placed a steady hand on her wrist. Sarah, please. A deep breath. Then, in a whisper so soft it was barely audible, this flight was cleared for an emergency reroute before we even left the ground. Keanu's stomach dropped. Keanu glanced back toward the cabin. The digital flight display above the aisle still said, New York, JFK. But if Sarah was right, that was a lie. Keanu's throat went dry. Then where are we actually going? Sarah's eyes flickered toward the cockpit door. Then, barely above a whisper, that's the part one don't know. Keanu felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He turned his attention back to the cockpit door. I need to speak to the pilots. Sarah grabbed his arm. Her fingers were ice cold, tense, desperate. No, she whispered. You can't. Keanu frowned. Why? She licked her lips, eyes darting toward the cabin again, checking if anyone was listening. Then, because they're not flying the plane anymore. Keanu's pulse slammed. What? Sarah gripped his sleeve tighter. They haven't responded to a single transmission since we took off. No updates. No confirmations. No tower communication. Nothing. Keanu's blood ran cold. The cockpit was silent. Keanu exhaled slowly, processing. This wasn't just a simple hijacking. It was something worse. Keanu rubbed his jaw. Okay, let's back up. Why did you say Victor wasn't supposed to be on this flight? Sarah hesitated. Then, because he originally booked private jet. Keanu's stomach twisted. Sarah continued, whispering fast now, like she was afraid she wouldn't get another chance. He was set to fly, alone. Last minute, his team switched him to this plane instead. I overheard the ground crew questioning him. Keanu's fingers tightened into a fist. They didn't know why. No one did, but they were ordered not to ask questions. Keanu swallowed hard. They switched him here for a reason. He turned back toward the cabin, his eyes locking onto Victor. And Victor was already watching him. Victor lifted his glass. And then he winked. Keanu felt his jaw clench. Because that wink, it wasn't just arrogance. It was a message. He knew Keanu was asking questions. Wanted him to. And that meant Victor wasn't worried at all. Keanu turned back to Sarah. How many people on this flight were last-minute additions? Sarah frowned. What do you mean? Keanu exhaled sharply. If Victor wasn't supposed to be here, who else got moved? Sarah hesitated, then reached for her tablet. She scrolled through the passenger manifest, her fingers moving fast. Keanu watched her expression change. Her lips parted slightly. Then, she slowly turned the screen toward him. Keanu's eyes narrowed. 7 seats. 7 last-minute passengers. And none of them had returned flights booked. Keanu scanned the names. Row 3C, the man with the black earpiece. Row 6A, a woman who hadn't said a single word the entire flight. Row 9F, a man in a business suit pretending to read, but his eyes never moved across the page. 7 people, 7 ghosts, and something terrifying hit Keanu like a punch to the gut. They weren't passengers. They were operatives. This wasn't a takeover. It was a coordinated mission. Keanu pulled out his phone and quickly texted his intelligence contact. Envelope with arrow. 7 last-minute passengers. All plants. Need to know what's happening now. The reply came within seconds. Envelope with arrow. Stand by. checking air control records. Keanu turned back to Sarah. Are there any records of the pilots responding at all? Sarah bit her lip, then hurried over to a radio panel at the galley wall. She quickly adjusted the frequency, twisting the dial. Then suddenly static crackled. For a moment, nothing. Then a single recorded voice. Studio microphone. Flight 417. This is JFK approach. Confirm route correction. Repeat. Confirm route correction. Silence. Keanu and Sarah stared at each other. Then, studio microphone. Flight 417. Do you copy? Flight 417. A sudden break. Hey, click. And then, studio microphone. Acknowledged. Proceeding with directive. Keanu's blood turned ice cold. Because that voice? It wasn't the captain. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. That wasn't. Keanu swallowed hard. That wasn't a pilot. His phone vibrated again. Envelope with arrow. Confirmed. Flight 417 never filed a landing route. Envelope with arrow. This plane has no destination. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He turned toward Victor. And Victor? He was still sipping his whiskey. Still smirking. Still waiting. Because the game had only just begun. Keanu Reeves had faced danger before. But never like this. This wasn't a street fight. This wasn't a Hollywood stunt gone wrong. This was something else entirely. A plane with no destination. A cockpit that had gone silent. A team of operatives disguised as passengers. And a businessman who wasn't worried at all. Keanu's fingers curled into a fist. They were heading somewhere. And whatever waited at the end of this flight. It wasn't an airport. Keanu's instincts screamed at him. He turned his gaze back toward row 3C. The man with the black earpiece. He was pretending to read, but his posture was too controlled. He wasn't relaxed. He was monitoring. Keanu exhaled slowly. If Victor was the mastermind, then this man, he was the enforcer. And enforcers only had one job. Keep the plane on course. Then, beep. Another one. Louder. Keanu's heart pounded. Every time that sound echoed through the cabin, something changed. Victor's assistant, Nash, lifted his head slightly, awaiting some kind of silent confirmation. Row 3C's fingers tightened around his book. And Victor? He simply smiled, like a man watching a chessboard, knowing every move had already been planned. Keanu needed more information, so he looked deeper. His gaze traveled toward row 6A, the woman in the charcoal business suit. She had been sitting still the entire flight. No conversación, no phone, no interacción. And now, she was waiting, like she already knew what was coming next. Keanu's pulse quickened. Keanu wasn't just listening to the beeps anymore. He was tracking them. Because now, he knew what they were. They weren't a countdown. They were a sequence. Each beep signaled a different stage of the operation. And if that was true, they were already past the third beep, which meant they were halfway through the plan. Sarah, the flight attendant, returned. But this time, her hands shook. She placed a tray on Keanu's table, but her eyes were locked on Victor. Then, under her breath, "It's happening soon." Keanu's stomach twisted. "What's happening?" Sarah didn't blink. Whatever they're waiting for. Keanu leaned closer to Sarah, his voice low. "How many crew members are supposed to be on board?" Sarah frowned. 6. Keanu's jaw clenched. "And how many have you actually seen?" A pause. Then Sarah's face drained of color. 4. Keanu felt his pulse hammering. 2 missing crew members. 2 ghosts. Were they in the cockpit? Were they already gone? Or worse, were they never crew members at all? Keanu's phone vibrated. Envelope with arrow. No flight plan filed. This plane should have checked in an hour ago. Envelope with arrow. Air traffic control thinks you disappeared. Keanu's hands tightened around the armrest. The entire world thought this plane was off the grid, which meant nobody was coming to help. Keanu turned back toward Victor, and for the first time, Victor's smirk was gone. Not because he was worried, because now he was focused. Because the next phase of the plan was about to begin. Because, beep, Keanu's entire body locked up. Fourth beep, Victor lifted his drink, took a slow sip. Then, without looking at Keanu, he murmured, "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." Keanu inhaled deeply. Everything was leading up to one moment, one move, one final piece of the game. Victor set his glass down gently. Then he turned, looked Keanu dead in the eyes, and with a voice so calm it sent a chill down his spine, he said, "Checkmate." Then, collision. The cabin lights went out. The plane tilted sharply. Passengers gasped. Sarah grabbed the edge of a seat. And Keanu realized the game had just changed because the plane was descending. The cabin lurched violently. For the first time, passengers screamed. Overhead luggage compartments rattled, a few snapping open. A carry-on bag tumbled into the aisle. Keanu gripped the armrest, steadying himself. The cabin lights flickered wildly. And outside the window, nothing but darkness. They were dropping. Keanu's pulse hammered. This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was deliberate. The plane wasn't just descending. It was being forced down. Keanu turned toward Victor Hargrove. And what did he see? Not panic, not fear. Victor calmly swirled the last of his whiskey, watching the chaos around him, like an amused spectator. Keanu gritted his teeth. Victor knew this was coming. He had been waiting for it. And that meant this wasn't just an operation. It was a test. Keanu turned toward the galley. Sarah, the flight attendant, clung to a seat, eyes wide with fear. The other two attendants? Nowhere to be seen. Keanu leaned close. "Where's the rest of your crew?" Sarah swallowed hard. I don't know." Keanu's stomach twisted. There were supposed to be 6. They had only seen 4, and now only 2 remained. The others didn't just disappear. They had been removed. Keanu's mind raced. This wasn't a normal hijacking. No masked gunmen. No demands. No scouting. Just a quiet, calculated takeover. And the worst part? Most of the passengers still didn't even realize. They had no idea their plane wasn't landing in New York. Keanu needed to act. Fast. He steadied himself against the shifting cabin and moved toward the cockpit door. Sarah's eyes went wide. "Wait, you can't." Keanu ignored her. He reached the door, tried the handle. Locked. No surprise there. He knocked. Hard. "Captain." No response. Keanu exchanged a look with Sarah. Then, from behind the door, studio microphone, static. A single crackle through the speakers. Then, a voice. Studio microphone, flight 417, proceeding as directed. Keanu froze. That wasn't the captain. That voice was wrong. Too calm. Too measured. Too detached. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God!" Keanu exhaled. "The pilots, they're not in control, are they?" Sarah shook her head, slowly. Studio microphone ETA to secondary approach. 22 minutes. Keanu's jaw clenched. They were heading somewhere. And now he had a timeline. Keanu's phone buzzed. Envelope with arrow. Confirmed. Flight 417 still off radar. No landing filed. Envelope with arrow. You are not on record anymore. Keanu inhaled sharply. They weren't just flying under the radar. They had been erased. Keanu turned back toward the cabin. His eyes swept the passengers, looking for movement, looking for a reaction. That's when he saw row 9F, a man in an expensive suit, holding a closed book. But Keanu noticed something. His thumb gently tapping. Once, twice, 3 times. A signal. Keanu locked eyes with the man in row 9F. For the briefest second, the man hesitated, like he had just realized Keanu was watching him. Then he stood. Keanu's pulse quickened. Row 3C, the enforcer, stood as well. And row 6A, the silent woman, reached into her coat pocket. Keanu's muscles tensed. It was happening. Whatever. Phase 5 was... It was happening now. Keanu had no time left. He turned back to Victor, who now sat, completely still. Glass empty. Hands folded. Waiting. Keanu exhaled slowly. Tell me where this plane is going. Victor tilted his head slightly. Then, with the calmest voice Keanu had ever heard, he replied, "Why don't you ask the real passenger in charge?" Keanu's stomach dropped. Before he could react, a shadow stepped forward from the very back of the plane, and Keanu's blood ran cold, because the face he saw was the pilot, and he was no longer in uniform. Keanu knew he had one option: act now. He stood, moving toward the front of the cabin. A flight attendant blocked his way. "Sir, I need you to remain seated." Keanu's voice was quiet but firm. "I need to speak to the captain. Now!" Before she could answer, Row 3C stood up. For the first time, the man dropped his neutral expression. His eyes locked onto Keanu. In his right hand, barely visible beneath his jacket, was a black earpiece. Keanu's jaw clenched. They weren't just being watched. They were being coordinated. The man took a step forward. "Mr. Reeves, I suggest you return to your seat." Keanu didn't blink. Or what? A pause. A tiny, knowing smirk. Keanu suddenly realized this man wasn't just a bodyguard. He was a handler. And Victor wasn't the only VIP on this flight. The pilot, or rather, the man who used to be the pilot, stood at the back of the cabin. No uniform, no name tag, just a quiet presence, blending in with the other passengers until now. Keanu felt his pulse, slow, not from fear, but from calculation. How long has he been back here? Why didn't anyone notice? And most importantly, who was flying the plane now? The former pilot took 2 steps forward. Slow, deliberate. Passengers barely reacted. Some still clutched their armrests from the earlier descent, unaware of the true danger surrounding them. Keanu wasn't fooled. This wasn't a passenger reclaiming his seat. This was a man stepping into his real role. Victor watched him approach, his smirk subtler than ever, like he was watching the final act of a play he had already seen. Keanu exhaled sharply. "I assume you're the one in charge now." The former pilot stopped, a small, quiet smile. "I always was." Keanu clenched his jaw. "Where are we going?" The man didn't answer immediately. He simply turned, his gaze flicking toward the cockpit door. Then, in the calmest voice Keanu had ever heard, "Why does it matter? You're never getting off." Sarah gasped. A woman in row 7 covered her mouth, finally realizing something was wrong. And Victor? Victor simply picked up his empty glass, like he already knew this was coming. Keanu took a slow breath. If they weren't landing, that meant they were either Keycap 1, refueling midair, unlikely for a commercial flight. Keycap 2, changing transponder codes and disappearing for good. Keycap 3, crashing. But Victor wouldn't be this calm if that was the plan. His phone vibrated again. Envelope with arrow. Urgent. Air traffic control just got a new signal from your plane. It's broadcasting under a different flight number. Keanu's pulse spiked. They were already erasing the plane's identity, turning it into something new, something untraceable. Envelope with arrow, new flight ID, Phoenix 1. Keanu's breath hitched. That name, Phoenix. He'd heard it before. Not in movies, not in conspiracy theories, but in classified circles. This wasn't just a hijacking. This was an operation. And now, Keanu wasn't just a passenger in danger. He was a witness to something no one was supposed to see. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then, beep. The last beep from Nash's device. The final phase of the plan. Keanu exhaled slowly. It was time. He turned to Victor. "What happens now?" Victor smiled, standing up smoothly. He straightened his suit, adjusting his cuffs. Then he simply said, Now we disappear." And with that collision, the entire plane went dark. The engines cut. The oxygen masks didn't deploy. Just silence. A full-blown blackout at 30,000 feet. Somewhere in the chaos, Keanu's phone screen blinked. One last message, sent before everything went dark. Envelope with arrow. If I don't check in, find out what Phoenix 1 is. Envelope with arrow, sent. Then, nothing. Just cold, empty darkness. In a plane that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Passengers screamed. The plane plunged lower. Keanu felt his breath hitch as something shifted in the air. Victor's voice cut through the chaos, calm, certain. Welcome to the other side. Then, collision, black screen, cut to silence. Police car light. To be continued, police car light.